Okay, so you're here with us at the deep dive because well, you want to know what's what, right? You want to be in the know, but you don't want to have to wade through, a ton of info to get there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's what we do here. And today, we have a really interesting set of materials in front of us.
Yeah, we do.
We've got a quiz, we've got an answer key, we've got some essay questions, we've got a glossary, and it's all around this topic of Aruba travel insurance.
Uh,
And
huh.
specifically, looks like it's slanted towards visitors coverage.
Right. Yeah, it looks like they're the main provider that this is kind of focusing on.
Right.
So yeah, think of this as like your shortcut to understanding the important stuff about Aruba travel insurance.
Yeah, we're gonna go deep.
Yeah.
We're gonna
Today we're gonna go
we're
deep.
gonna pull out those crucial insights and save you the headache of having to do it yourself.
Right.
Exactly. All right, so let's jump right in.
Yeah. Let's do it.
Um, the quiz kicks off with a pretty fundamental question. I mean, if you're thinking about Aruba travel insurance, the first thing you want to know is it mandatory?
Right. Is it required?
Right. Is it required
Yeah.
for visitors to Aruba? So based on what we have here, what can we say about that?
What's interesting is that it's not actually explicitly stated whether or not it is.
Hmm.
The answer key actually directly says, we don't know based on these excerpts whether it's mandatory or not.
Right. So that's a pretty significant piece of non-information. We've got this whole document about Aruba travel insurance, and yet whether or not you actually need it
Yeah.
isn't addressed.
Yeah, it's almost like they're focusing on making you want it,
Right.
regardless of whether you actually need it.
Right, maybe focusing on the benefits and all that.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's look at the titles of these documents. We've got it's called a study guide for Aruba travel insurance, and then the other one is titled Aruba travel insurance, visitors coverage. So what do those titles tell us in combination about what this information is?
Well, the study guide, I think, points to a more educational or informative purpose.
Uh-huh.
Like something you'd read to get a general understanding
Yeah.
of Aruba travel insurance.
Sounds broad.
Yeah.
Right, like
Yeah.
it's covering the landscape
Exactly.
of Aruba travel insurance.
Right. But then the second title, with the colon separating Aruba travel insurance from visitors coverage,
Right.
sort of signals a shift. Yeah, it's still about Aruba travel insurance, but
Yeah.
now the focus is narrowed,
Okay.
specifically visitors coverage and what they offer. So
So it's almost like you start out wide
yeah.
and then zoom in.
Yeah, you're starting with that wide angle lens and then you're zooming in.
Okay, that's a subtle but important distinction.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so one of the other excerpts has a heading. It says Visitors Coverage Support. What does that immediately bring to mind when you see that?
Yeah. Support usually means, help customer service contact information.
Mm-hmm.
The things you would look for if you had a question about a particular product or service.
Right.
And the answer key seems to confirm this. It
Yeah.
says that this section probably provides contact details and resources specifically for visitors coverage customers.
Mm.
So again, it really emphasizes that we're not looking at a totally neutral overview of Aruba travel insurance.
Right. This is coming from Visitors Coverage.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the quiz then gets into some more hypothetical territory. Question 5 asks about the specific benefits of purchasing Aruba travel insurance. And now, since the source material doesn't explicitly lay those out, it kind of prompts us to think about what are the kinds of things travel insurance typically covers. So what would you say are some of those key areas?
Yeah. Well, I think a major one is coverage for unexpected medical expenses.
Yeah.
If you get sick or injured while you're in Aruba, that can be, a huge financial burden.
Absolutely. And, nobody plans on it, but medical care in a foreign country can be incredibly expensive.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And then, of course, there's the, kind of the dreaded trip cancellation or interruption. Life happens sometimes. You have to change your travel plans unexpectedly, and insurance can help recoup those non-refundable costs.
Right, exactly. And sometimes those costs can be pretty substantial.
Yeah, exactly. Especially if you booked, flights and hotels and all kinds of things in advance.
Yeah.
What about more common things like lost or delayed baggage?
Yeah, that's another one that can be, it's not life or death, but it can certainly be a big hassle.
Right.
And insurance can often help with that, reimburse you for the inconvenience
Right.
or for having to buy new clothes or whatever you need.
Right.
And then, of course, there's the big one, emergency medical evacuation, which is something you hope you never need, but can be absolutely essential if a really critical situation arises.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if you need to be airlifted out of somewhere,
Exactly.
you want to make sure you've got that coverage.
For sure.
So it's important to keep in mind, though, that those are, kind of potential benefits.
Right.
Those are the types of things that
Sure.
travel insurance can cover. This particular document doesn't detail, exactly what visitors' coverages Aruba policies include or don't include.
Right.
But those are the key areas to kind of have in the back of your mind.
Yeah. Those are the things to be thinking about for
Yeah.
sure. Okay, so building on that, question 6 kind of explores this idea of the potential key differences between various travel insurance plans for Aruba. And it's kind of hypothetical because we don't have the specifics.
Right.
But if you were kind of broadly comparing different plans.
Yeah. What are some of the main distinctions that you might typically see?
Well, I think one of the most obvious ones is going to be level of coverage.
Okay.
You might have a basic plan that covers just the essentials. And then you might have a more comprehensive option with higher limits and broader protection.
Right. So it's kind of like good, better, best
Exactly.
in a way.
And then the specific risks that are covered can also vary a lot. One plan might have great medical coverage, but not much for travel disruptions. Whereas another one might prioritize trip cancellations and baggage issues.
Right. So it's really about knowing what matters most.
Exactly. What are your priorities?
Yeah, and making sure that the policy you choose is aligned with that.
For sure.
And, while we're specifically talking about Aruba here, travel insurance can also differ in its geographical scope. Some policies are worldwide.
Right.
Some are more regional. But I imagine for Aruba specific plans, the main variations would be, like we said, in the depth and breadth of what's covered and the dollar amounts.
We're at the limits.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So moving on to who this information is intended for, question 7 in the quiz asks about the likely target audience. So based on the titles and the content we've seen so far, who do you think Visitors Coverage is trying to reach with this material?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty safe to say they're aiming at individuals who are planning a trip to Aruba and who are considering purchasing travel insurance. The focus on Aruba and the mention of travel insurance in the titles makes that pretty obvious.
Right. It's not a huge mystery.
No, not at all.
Okay.
Yeah.
So question 8 asks a really practical question. It says, what's the purpose of including contact information for visitors coverage within these materials?
So what do you think is the logical reason for that?
Well, I mean, it's all about making it easy for potential customers to get in touch with them, right?
Yeah.
They want you to be able to ask questions
Right.
about their Aruba policies and ultimately to purchase coverage if it seems like a good fit.
Right. It's kind of a call to action, even if it doesn't say, buy now.
Exactly, yeah.
It's like, here's how to reach us if you're interested.
Exactly.
Okay, so question 9 asks us to kind of zoom out a little bit and think about the comprehensiveness of this source material, based solely on these excerpts. How in-depth does it seem to be?
Yeah, I mean, based on what we've seen so far with the quiz format and the fact that it's called a study guide and the real focus on visitors coverage, it feels more like an introduction or maybe even a promotional piece.
Right.
It's meant to get you thinking about Aruba travel insurance, but it's not necessarily an exhaustive guide to everything you need to know.
Right. It's not like the encyclopedia
Exactly.
of Aruba travel. Okay. Question 10 then dives into another hypothetical section. It talks about, what if this document had a section called emergency medical assistance? What kind of vital information would we expect to find in there?
Well, you'd probably find details on how to access medical care in Aruba. Information on hospitals and clinics, emergency services.
Right.
And importantly, you would expect it to outline how to contact visitors coverage in case of a medical emergency.
Yeah. Who to call.
Exactly. Yeah.
What information you need to have ready.
Exactly. And you would also really need to know what types of medical expenses are covered.
Right.
Are you covered for doctor visits, hospital stays, prescriptions?
Right. Does it cover pre-existing conditions?
Right, exactly.
Things like that.
Yeah, all of those details would be super important to know.
Right, because that's what you're buying it for.
Exactly.
Okay, so beyond the quiz, we also have these essay format questions. And even though we don't have the full essays, the topics themselves kind of give us some broader insights into what's considered important,
All right.
In the realm of Aruba travel insurance.
Yeah, absolutely.
So one of the questions asks about the potential benefits of Aruba travel insurance, even if it's not legally mandated. So it's really pushing you to think about, what are those unforeseen circumstances that can arise and how can insurance provide a safety net?
Right, because even if it's not required, there might be really good reasons to have it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Another question looks at the role of providers like VisitorsCoverage in making travel safer and less stressful.
Uh-huh.
So it's kind of encouraging a look at, how do these insurance companies contribute to a positive travel experience?
Right. It's not just about, you know, reimbursing you financially. It's
Yeah.
about, peace of mind and having someone to help you if something goes wrong.
Right.
Yeah.
There's a question that asks what essential information should be included in a comprehensive resource from Visitors Coverage.
Mhm.
So that's interesting because it kind of helps us identify the gaps in what we have here
Right. What's missing?
and kind of highlights what a more thorough guide would ideally cover.
Exactly.
And then there's this really interesting question that compares, the kind of information you would get from a travel insurance company versus what you might find on like an official Aruba tourism website
Mhm.
regarding health and safety.
Yeah.
So it really underscores the importance of consulting multiple sources.
Right. Don't just rely on one.
Right?
The tourism website might have general health advisories and emergency contacts for the country,
Right.
whereas visitors coverage is going to tell you specifically how their policies address those risks.
Right.
And then finally, one of the essay prompts really emphasizes, the importance of understanding the terms and conditions of any travel insurance policy before you travel.
Right. Read the fine print.
Yeah, exactly. You need to know what you're paying for, what's covered and what's not covered.
Absolutely. That's crucial.
Yeah.
Okay, and that brings us to the glossary of key terms. The world of insurance can sometimes feel like it has its own language.
Right. A lot of jargon.
Right.
Yeah.
So these definitions are really helpful.
Yeah, for sure.
So just to highlight a few, we've got, travel insurance itself, which is
Mhm.
defined as, protection against those unexpected events during travel.
Uh-huh.
Medical issues, trip cancellations, those kinds of things.
Yeah, and then there's coverage,
Mm-hmm.
which refers to, the scope of what the policy protects,
Yeah.
how much it will pay out.
Right.
And then benefits are the specific things that the policy covers,
Mm-hmm.
like reimbursement for medical bills or lost luggage.
Right. And then importantly, exclusions are what the policy does not cover,
Exactly.
which is something everyone needs to be aware of.
Uh-huh.
And we see visitors coverage defined in here as a provider of travel insurance to specific destinations.
Right.
And then we see mandatory insurance defined as insurance that is required by law, which, as we noted earlier, isn't actually confirmed
Right.
for Aruba in these materials.
Right.
And then we have emergency medical assistance, which are, services to help you in case of a medical crisis while you're traveling, and then trip cancellation interruption.
Which is what covers you if you have to change your plans
Exactly.
unexpectedly.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so as we wrap up our deep dive into this, material on Aruba travel insurance from Visitors Coverage, what are the key takeaways? If someone's been listening along, what do they really need to remember?
Well, I think the big things are that, we still don't know for sure whether travel insurance is mandatory for Aruba.
Right.
So that's something you're going to need to verify independently.
Go to the official source.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And this material seems to be more of like an introduction or a starting point to Visitors Coverage's offerings
Uh-huh.
rather than like a super comprehensive guide to all the options out there.
Right.
And, we've talked about some potential benefits and how plans might differ, but you're going to want to really look closely at the policy details
Right.
to understand the specifics.
Read that fine print.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think the biggest takeaway is, understand those terms and conditions before you travel.
Know what you're getting into.
Right.
Make sure it meets your needs.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So as you continue planning your trip to Aruba, think of this as a starting point.
Yeah.
Go and do your own research,
Uh-huh.
look into the official requirements for Aruba, and then, really think about your individual circumstances.
Right.
What are you most worried about happening?
Exactly.
What are those what ifs?
Yeah, what are your priorities?
Yeah,
What
yeah.
concerns?
And then you can really start to evaluate the different options out there.
For sure.
And make sure you're choosing a policy that's the best fit for you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
I guess so.
thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
Yeah, this was fun.
And safe travels.
Yeah, safe travels.
Enjoy Aruba.
Enjoy Aruba.
Whenever you go.
Yeah, it's
Beautiful.
All right.